Every time you roll your eyes and say something like, "Oh, great, another Monday," you are performing an act that the ancient Greeks described as tearing flesh from bone. That is not a metaphor. That is the literal etymology of the word sarcasm. And by the end of this video, you will never use it quite the same way again. To understand where sarcasm comes from, you need to picture the ancient Greek world, specifically the culture of public speech, debate, and performance that defined civic life in cities like Athens. Greeks took language seriously, dangerously seriously. A well-placed insult in a public forum could destroy reputation. Rhetoric was a weapon, and the sharpest rhetoricians were celebrated for their ability to cut an opponent down with words. There was even a whole tradition of competitive mockery built into Greek comedy, philosophy, and political debate. This was a culture where words were understood to have physical weight, where saying the wrong thing to the wrong person carried real consequences. So, when the Greeks reached for a metaphor to describe the cruelest, most cutting kind of verbal attack, the kind that leaves the target humiliated and exposed, they did not reach for something gentle. They reached for an image of raw, brutal physicality. They thought about what it looks like when an animal strips flesh from a carcass, and they built a word from that image. Origin story. The word sarcasm enters English in the 1570s, recorded as sarcasmus, a biting taunt, a jibe, a satirical remark. That form came directly from late Latin sarcasmus. But the Latin borrowed it wholesale from late Greek, sarkasmos, meaning a sneer, a jest, a taunt, or mockery. Now, here's where it gets visceral. Sarkasmos comes from the Greek verb sarkazein, which meant to speak bitterly, to sneer, but its literal original meaning was to strip off the flesh, like a dog. The Greeks were explicitly picturing the way a dog tears meat from a bone when they coined this term for a particular kind of verbal cruelty. And the root underneath that verb is sarx, genitive form sarkos, meaning flesh. Specifically, it did not mean the human body in an abstract sense. Sarx meant a piece of meat, raw, physical, torn meat. So the lineage is clear. Sarx, meaning meat. Sarkazein, meaning to tear that meat off. Sarkasmos, meaning the act of doing that with words. Sarcasmus in Latin, and finally sarcasm in English, the modern spelling settling in during the 1610s. Now, who was actually using this word in its early Latin and Greek forms? Rhetoric teachers and scholars were the primary audience. Think of figures like the Roman rhetorician Quintilian, writing in the 1st century AD, who categorized different forms of irony and mockery in his massive work on oratory, the Institutio Oratoria. Quintilian was working in Rome around 95 AD, codifying exactly the kinds of biting verbal attacks that Sarcasmus described. He understood that there was a category of speech designed not just to argue, but to wound. Centuries later, when scholars in the late medieval period were translating Greek rhetorical texts into Latin, they carried sarcasmus with them. By the time English writers in the 1570s needed a word for this specific flavor of cutting mockery, not just irony, not just satire, but the kind of remark designed to make someone feel small and exposed, they borrowed sarcasmus directly from that Latin tradition. The 1610s refinement into the spelling we use today happened during a period when English was aggressively absorbing classical vocabulary. Writers and scholars of that era were consciously reaching into Latin and Greek to build a more precise language. And sarcasm fit perfectly because English had no single word that captured that particular combination of wit and cruelty. The misconception. Here is the part that tends to surprise people. Most of us, if we think about the origin of sarcasm at all, assume it comes from some vaguely ironic Greek concept, something to do with humor or cleverness. People sometimes say it comes from a word meaning to bite, which is close but misses the specific violence of the original image. The real misconception is treating sarcasm as a fundamentally playful word with a sharp edge. The Greek sarkazein was not describing a clever person making a witty remark, it was describing something predatory. The image embedded in the word is a dog stripping flesh from bone, not a wit making a sharp comeback at a dinner party. When we call something light sarcasm, or describe someone as gently sarcastic, we are using a word whose core image is raw and aggressive. The original Greek concept had no gentle version. Sarkasmos was an attack. It was the verbal equivalent of being torn apart, and that connects directly to another word built from the same root, sarcophagus. That word literally means flesh-eater in Greek. Sarx, flesh, plus phagein, to eat. The Greeks used it for the stone coffins that were believed to decompose bodies quickly. The same root that gives us a word for a witty comeback also gives us the word for a stone box that consumes the dead. That is the company sarcasm keeps etymologically. Modern echoes that original meaning, flesh-tearing, predatory, exposing, has not fully disappeared. It surfaces in how we actually use sarcasm at its most intense. When sarcasm is used to genuinely humiliate someone, When it is deployed to expose someone's failure in front of others, we instinctively recognize that it has crossed a line from humor into something else. We say things like, "that was vicious," or "that was a real dig." Those descriptions are not accidental. They are reaching for the same physical, aggressive imagery the Greeks embedded in the original word. Therapists and communication researchers today distinguish between what they call affiliative sarcasm, the kind shared between friends, and aggressive sarcasm, the kind designed to demean. The Greeks did not have that distinction. For them, sarkasmos was always the aggressive kind. The modern softening of the word is a cultural revision, not a linguistic one. The flesh-tearing is still there in the roots, even when the surface looks like a joke. Deeper connections. The sarx root does not stop at sarcasm and sarcophagus. It runs through a whole cluster of medical and anatomical terms in English. Sarcoma, the type of cancer that affects connective tissues, muscle, and bone, that is sarx plus the Greek suffix for tumor. You are literally talking about a flesh tumor. Sarcomere, the basic unit of muscle fiber. Sarcoplasm, the cytoplasm of muscle cells. Every one of those words carries that same ancient Greek root for meat and flesh. And this reveals something important about how Greek medical vocabulary was built. Greek physicians, working in the tradition that stretches from Hippocrates in the 5th century BC through Galen in the 2nd century AD, built their anatomical language out of direct physical description. They named things by what they were made of or what they did. Sarx, flesh, became the building block for any term involving soft tissue. Sarcasm belongs to that same tradition of blunt, physical Greek naming. The Greeks looked at a particular kind of verbal attack and said, "That does the same thing to a person that a dog does to a carcass," and they named it accordingly. The word has been refined and softened through Latin, through centuries of English usage, through drawing room wit and internet irony. But strip all of that away and you're back to the original image. Teeth, flesh, the thing laid bare. That is the word you are using when you say, "Oh sure, I love being stuck in traffic," a small piece of something much older and much less polite. What is next? If the hidden violence inside everyday words is the kind of thing that keeps